All right, we're going to go ahead and get started here. I have 2:30 on my clock. Thank you everyone for joining today. I'm very excited to share, grateful for the opportunity to share. My name is Lindsey Hayes. I'm a PhD recent graduate. I just earned my PhD last month, this month. I officially graduate in August. I am a student or was a student in learning design and technology in the College of Education. So I approach a lot of this work as an educator from the learning sciences. So I'm a learning scientist. We study how people learn, how we can design spaces to help people learn better, and then how we can use technology to do that. So my presentation today is about the implications of COVID-19 and then how we can use some educational models to impact how the future of church might work. So just to give you some background on what we're going to talk about today, just three main topics. First, just the drawbacks and benefits of online spaces. Second, how hybrids of faith networks work. That's a lot of what my research was about, how people are engaging in faith networks, both online and offline. And then looking at a flipped church model, and probably what I am saying might be what the future of church looks like. So just again, from a theoretical background, again, I'm approaching this as an educator, and I'm looking at the church, especially the preaching moment, as an informal learning environment. So there's some scientists out there, learning scientists, that say 70% of learning actually happens in informal settings and not necessarily in like a K through 12 school system. And I think church and the preaching moment is one of those informal settings. And from an education perspective, the teaching or preaching moment, where you have one person doing direct instruction or lecturing to a group of people and hoping that that information is received or learned, is an antiquated educational system. And we have some new educational systems or other ways of learning and teaching that might be better equipped to get whoever you want to learn to receive the information and retain the information. So I'm really approaching church and looking at churches as communities of practice. So you have communities or group of people who are coming together, they're problem solvers, and they're learning from each other, who are surrounded by or coupled by this domain or have a shared interest or topic of knowledge. And then they're practicing this knowledge. So it's not just memorizing, they have the information and they're done, but they're also practitioners, or they have the shared living curriculum and they're trying to develop and become more effective practitioners. So this was really birthed out of, if you think like apprenticeship models, where you have someone who is watching other people do what they're doing, and they're shadowing them and they're in the practice or learning from others, as opposed to sitting down and being lectured to or reading about how to be a plumber. Instead, you're out in the field and you're learning from a community of people who are plumbers and you're trying to be more effective. And I see the same thing happening with how we could approach the church in terms of learning and Christian education. So this first part, this is really anecdotal, but I just want to go through kind of the drawbacks and the benefits of online spaces. And a lot of this was birthed from my research that started in 2015 before COVID, and I just finished it, which happened right at COVID. So a lot of this overlaps, but just a brief overview of some of the drawbacks and benefits of online spaces. And we're going to look at this from a spectrum perspective. So we have traditionalists who really aren't open to a lot of technology uses or online faith engagement. We have progressives who are welcome to it, and then we have people who are somewhere in between. So I'm not advocating for any of these. We're just going to kind of look at these from an equal view and work through what are the different perceptions, and then how have these perceptions changed since COVID-19 has happened. So first, the traditionalists. So traditionalists, when we're looking at connection, community, content, commitment, giving, and then like relationship and reverence. In terms of connection, they would argue, traditionalists would argue, that online community really doesn't provide an authentic connection. If you want to type in, while I'm going through these, anything you've heard from traditionalists, whether you are a traditionalist yourself, or if it's not your viewpoint, but you've heard other people kind of say these things, or what people in this group might say, if you want to type that in, that's helpful too. But in terms of connection, it's not the same. You really can't connect in online spaces. In terms of community, they perceive online spaces to create isolation, and faith requires community. So there's pushback there. In terms of content, there's a lot of hesitation in terms of who are you being shepherded by, especially in the online faith context, and are the blind leading the blind. So whenever you're going into these online spaces and watching online sermons, who is this preacher? Are they biblically sound? Are they sound in many other ways? In terms of commitment, a lot of the pushback is towards millennials. Millennials are lazy. You just need to get out of bed and go to church. And it seems like online spaces are perceived as a lack of commitment to your faith engagement. In terms of giving, how do you serve if you're online and you're sitting behind a computer screen? And then there's this lack or perceived lack of reverence in terms of respecting and preserving the traditions and the rituals that are in the church. So traditionalists are pushing back against a lot of these online spaces and just saying, especially using Hebrews, when I did a lot of my research and talked to even millennials about why do we need to meet and collect in person, a lot of them reference the scripture, forsake not the assembling of ourselves together. And traditionalists kind of push back against these online spaces. Then we go to progressives. Progressives are on the other end of the spectrum. In terms of community, in terms of connection, I can practice and engage anywhere. I can connect with the Holy Spirit no matter whether I'm in the building or I'm outside. Community is real, whether it's online. I can FaceTime, I can text, I can be in community and still have these authentic interactions with people, whether I'm in person or not. In terms of content, what they like about online spaces is that you get diverse perspectives. So you're no longer bound by the geographical location of where you were born or where you live, and you can get the word from people outside of your city or outside of where you're born. The commitment, it's not about I'm going online because I'm not committed, but it's really more about efficiency, and I can pick and choose and find things that work best for me in these online spaces. In terms of giving, you can text to give, you can give remotely, and then progressives also believe that church or religion in general should not be a monument, it should be a movement. So if online spaces are allowing us to move with the culture, with the times, and reach the masses wherever we are now, we should continue to move and not be a monument. And some progressives might say, I love listening to sermons during my run and just really like the openness and the accessibility of it. And then we have people who fall in between. And you might be one of these people, you might not be on either end, but it really just depends on the situation. Where connection, you can connect in person and you value both online and in-person experiences. In terms of community, both groups can work in tandem. You can have online community that you really cherish, and you can have in-person community that's really important to you. The content, you have to vet your online sources. We know that you can't trust everything that you find on the internet, and you have to have reliable sources, and you should also have a shepherd who can help you take this content that you might be getting online and help you sift through the content that you're reaching. The commitment is that, you know, when I can physically attend and have that in-person fellowship experience, I will. And when I can't, I'm grateful for the online experiences that I'm able to still connect. In terms of giving, service can take different forms. So yes, I can give in person with my time, and yes, I can give online with my resources, and it really just depends. And then in terms of like the reverence or the respect, really technology, they don't see as evil or good. It's a tool. It's a tool, it's a God-given tool, and we can use it as a tool to reach and fish for the masses. So it's really interesting because before COVID, there were people on either side and was like, no, you need to go to church. No, you need to, you can be online. Bedside Baptist is okay. And it really just depends. I think it's really interesting to think, where were you? And then where are you now since COVID? And I've seen from both ends of the spectrums, what COVID has done has really opened up the online spaces for people who may have never sat down and watched church online are doing it now. And that's opening the door for some traditionalists to feel like, I never would have done this, but since I'm doing this, it's actually not that bad. I don't have to look for parking. I don't have to deal with the people. And there are some benefits to this online space that some people would have never experienced, but now they are. So on both sides of things, some people have moved more towards the progressive in terms of they're watching multiple services around the country on a Sunday morning. So you might, you know, tune into Enon at 7:30 in the morning, tune into Alfred Street at 10 o'clock, and then tune into somewhere else on the West Coast at your 2 o'clock slot. And you can go to all of these multiple churches on one Sunday because the commute is short, right? You know, when we were physically going, we had to go to church, we had to get home, we were going to one service and be done. But now we have the opportunity to watch multiple services in one sitting on a Sunday. Realizing that church is more than the building, really feeling the spirit wherever you are and feeling like you can connect and hear from God no matter whether you're in the building or not. And for some people, church in and of itself is a distraction in terms of physically getting there, having to go in person. And some people really like that at online. I don't have as many distractions because I can be tuned in directly to whoever's speaking. Now, on the other side of things, some people still, online has exposed the downfalls and the pitfalls of it in terms of missing the atmosphere of worship, especially communion and some of the rituals that we do that really make us feel connected to our church body. Physical ministries are really hard to replicate in terms of like dance ministries, the choir, some of the benevolent and giving ministries where you're going out into the community and affecting your physical world. That's really hard to replicate online. And then for some people, there are more distractions at home than there are whenever you're going to church. I remember one of my participants said, going to church is one of the only places where I will put my phone in my purse for 2 hours and not look at it. And now that we're online, you have the distractions of the things that are coming up on your phone or on your computer, or just the distractions of your family and things like that. So that takes me back over into my research and kind of looking at what I call these hybrid networks of practice. So my research, especially my dissertation research, was birthed from a lot of the data that said that millennials are the least connected to their faith, or least connected to religion, especially as compared to baby boomers and generations before us. But a lot of the data that was being pulled to say that millennials were least engaged was being pulled from physical attendance to religious services. And for me, there's a really big gap in the data because no one was looking at online engagement and how millennials may be engaging in online platforms and not physically attending. And that may be a reason why there's such a large gap. It could be disengagement, but also no one was really speaking to the online space. So my research specifically was looking at Black millennial females. So the average age of my group was 28. So they're probably 29, 30 right now. This data was done in 2019. They watched church online about half the time, but at the same time, the same amount attended church 1 to 3 times per month. 38%, so a little over a third of them preferred faith community in person. The same, a little over a third preferred their faith community to be online. And then about a quarter had no preference. So whether my faith community is online or in person, it didn't matter. So from this and from my research, I was able to pull what I call hybrid networks of practice. So this is before COVID, how my participants, these Black female millennials, were engaging in their faith practices was a hybrid network of online and in-person engagement. So the purple circles are in person, the yellow circles are online, and the green circles are individual practices. And what we found through my research was that the core, or like the church, the local church, was not the only place where people are getting their teachings and getting their preachings from. But they have these, and they've created their own hybrid networks where they're using online sermons, online music. They're doing individual prayer and fasting. They have online communities as well as in-person communities, as well as in-person churches. And all of these are working in tandem together. So one is not overpowering another, or one is not taking over another, but they're all being worked at in a hybrid practice. And I think especially with COVID, we're going to see a lot more of this, where you're not going to one source just for the meat of your spiritual or faith practices, but you're building out these hybrid networks. So what's unique about these hybrid networks, and these are 4 just different examples of different participants, is that they're dynamic, meaning that they're going to change over time. So for example, your local church might be your bread and butter. That might be the biggest node in your hybrid practice, and you're going to church 3 times a week, and then you move to a new city. And now you still want to be connected to that church, but now your hybrid network has changed because now your church is a smaller circle, and now you're connecting with your church online. So now you have a yellow circle that's bigger than your purple circle, and now you're engaging online. We see this a lot with college students who still want to stay connected to their churches back at home, but they're all dynamic. So that means over time, whether you are single or get married or move or you have kids, how you connect with your faith practices is going to change. It's going to be unique to each person. It's going to be unique to each learner. So how I connect with my faith practices in terms of how much I engage online or in person is going to be drastically different from my parents. It's going to be drastically different from my friends, from my sister. What we also found was that online spaces are supplemental, or they're working in harmony with in-person practices. So there's this big fear that online spaces are taking away or pulling away from these in-person practices. And my research didn't support that. And other research doesn't support that online is taking away from in-person practice, but that in-person fellowship is still the cornerstone practice. So even when people were engaging in these online spaces, they still were seeking out in-person fellowship experiences because that was the bread and butter of their faith practice. So as much online interactions that they had in terms of if they were watching online every day or listening to podcasts every day, there was something in them that still sought out in-person community and in-person fellowship. And oftentimes, in one of my participants' cases, it encouraged her to go back into church. So she was watching online weekly, and it made her think, why am I not going to church? And it made her start going to church again. So these online spaces can usher people back into these physical spaces. So I had one participant say, I could never put a limit on how much I can do outside of church because a Sunday service is a very small part of your entire spiritual journey. Like what happens the other 6 days of the week too. So these hybrid networks, yes, I have my Sunday service. Yes, I have my local church, but the other 6 days I'm listening to podcasts, I'm listening to online church, and you're supplementing what you're doing with your local in-person practice with some of these outside online practices. So I think that COVID's really going to push people when we are allowed back into in-person spaces, that some of these online practices and things that online community, online sermons that people have started to grapple with or start to engage with during the season, they're going to continue doing once we are able to physically go back into worship spaces. So just quickly, how online spaces can enhance faith practices. In terms of community, you get diverse perspectives. So if you grow up in a small town and everyone kind of has the same mentality, thinks the same, if you can find online community, you're able to expand your network and find some diverse perspectives. So that can help in terms of testimony, that can help in terms of if you're wrestling with something spiritually and no one in your town has wrestled with that, or no one that you know close to you has wrestled with that, you can go online and find other Christian practitioners or other believers who can help you in those situations. A lot of my participants brought up the separation from local community, and that some of them were preachers' kids, some of them grew up in churches that their grandparents had gone to, their parents had gone to, and now they go to. And there was a stigma against them sharing or being authentic or being able to really divulge what they were battling with because they didn't want the local community to know what was going on in their parents' house, what was going on in their grandparents' house, etc. And having an online community allowed them to separate from that stigma or from that fear of judgment. And they were allowed to go and find online practitioners and find online community who they could really shed themselves. And these people didn't know where they worked. They didn't know who their family was, and they could have some of these really authentic conversations in the online space. Online spaces also created safe spaces. So it's kind of like if you do a group project in school, sometimes your teacher picks the group for you and sometimes you can pick your own group. With online community, you can pick your own group. You're able to find people who you feel safe with, who you connect with, who you identify with, where you can really be authentic and share your true self. And again, learning is a social process. So being able to share and being able to talk back and being able to wrestle with your understandings and hear the perspective of other people is really important in that learning process. And if you don't have a safe space where you can feel like you can do that in a local church, you might be able to find that community online. In terms of domain or subject matter, what online does, or the benefit of that, is that it expands your networks of experts and teachers. So no longer, again, am I confined by just the people or just the pastors who are in my local community. I can go online and I can find preachers from California, from Florida, from Texas, from North Carolina, from Virginia, etc. And it expands my network of people who I can learn from. It also expands the subject matter variety. So if you think from a learning perspective of self-directed learning, if I'm really, really interested in something and I want to dive in and learn more about that subject area, now these online spaces are allowing me to learn more about whatever the subject area is. So maybe my pastor at home, in my home church, only preached on it for 2 weeks, but this is something that I'm really interested in diving in and learning more about. Now with online spaces, I can do a Google search, I can go on YouTube and find a sermon, and it expands the subject matter and gives me more variety. And the online space is really just creating an encyclopedia of video content. Now, the downside or the caveat, the fear with this, again, is that the blind might be leading the blind, and you don't really know who you're learning from. So it's really important to still have that shepherd or someone who you can connect with to help you engage with these texts or this teaching. And it also, one insight that came up from my research was that people were self-discipling, which can be dangerous. So in terms, what I mean when I say self-discipling is that if I only want to hear this teaching, I can just listen to this teaching for 3 weeks straight and not have a well-rounded discipleship or not have a well-rounded curriculum in terms of what I'm learning in Christian education. So if I don't want to hear about fasting, if I don't want to hear about giving, if I don't want to hear about certain topics, whenever the preacher goes to that subject, I can turn it off and go somewhere else. So it's really important to still have that shepherd or someone who's helping you have a well-rounded curriculum in terms of what you're learning online. And then lastly, the practice and how practice is enhanced. You can access these teachings and these preachings anywhere at any time. I have people who were commuting to work and were listening to sermons on their headphones, people who were running, people who were grocery shopping, people who were cleaning their house, cooking, all of these things. And it just allows you to access content anywhere and anytime. It helps you organize your faith tools. So especially when you think of like the Bible app and you're able to highlight text, you're able to search for text right on your phone. You're able to engage in devotionals or reading plans with other people, and you're able to create community around these applications online where you don't physically need to be in touch with people. And then the last thing is it enhances the sharing of resources. So if you're on the computer and you're listening to a sermon and you want to send that sermon to somebody, you can send it to them almost immediately, and they can either log in at that time, or if it's something that's saved and archived, they can go back and access it at any time. So these online spaces are helping, and there are benefits to all of these. There are also drawbacks, which I identify too, but these are some of the benefits to these online spaces. Which leads us to this last point and really looking at the future of church. And this is the point that I really want to talk about mostly and to hear your thoughts about, especially in this flipped church model. So from a learning perspective, again, having direct instruction or having someone lecture to you and hoping that everyone catches what you're saying is not necessarily the most effective learning model. Now, Black preaching, totally different. We talk back, I get it. And we have extremely gifted, dynamic preachers who do a phenomenal job. But from a learning perspective, learning is a social activity, right? You have to be able to talk to other people. You have to be able to wrestle with your ideas. You want to hear the perspectives of other people. And oftentimes, especially in large or mid-sized to church contexts where you have multiple services, we're coming into a building to sit and not talk to anybody. And then we have to get out before the next service comes. So we're sitting and listening, and it's very lecture style. So in the educational model, what we have is called a flipped classroom. So in a traditional classroom, everyone comes to school, you sit for the lecture, you leave, you go home, you do homework activities by yourself. In a flipped classroom model, the pastor, the preacher, the teacher sends out the lecture in advance. At home, the students are watching the lecture by themselves. They can stop, pause, record, replay. They have access to the lecture or to the preaching beforehand. And then when they're gathering in person with other people, that is when the group is coming together to learn from one another and to work on those activities and to work on those practice problems together. So from a learning perspective, again, it really does not make sense as an educator for all of us to bring all of these humans into this building to not be able to talk to each other. Because from a social learning perspective, the most important thing to do in this learning moment is to have people bounce ideas off of each other, share testimonies, give best practices. What are you wrestling with? This is the scripture that got me through that season. This is how I waited on the Lord and he came through, and sharing that and really looking at the people in your church as vessels who were full and not vessels that need to be filled. And when you do that, you distribute knowledge across multiple layers. So now the preacher is not the only one with knowledge, but the rest of the practitioners in the building, the rest of the members in the building, the deacons, the ministers, they're all also offering information whenever you're in these flipped classroom settings. So on one hand, you can send, so when I was theorizing about this, it was like, this is never going to happen, right? Like this was 2019. This is never going to happen. A preacher is not going to send out the sermon in advance. and have everybody watch it. And then when we come to church, everyone's going to talk. I didn't even think the first part was going to happen, that a preacher would be okay with everyone sitting and watching the sermon at home, because there was that stigma around online church about you need to get your butt up and come to church, right? And now, literally, as I was finishing my last couple chapters of this research, COVID-19 hit, and the first half has happened. We are watching lectures at home, or we are watching the sermon at home. Now, it's going to be really important as we move into this post-COVID, or as we start to come back and congregate together, what's going to happen to the second half of the flip. Because if we go back to normal, it's going to be really tough to encourage people who have now gotten used to online church about why are we coming in person. For me to sit and listen to a lecture and not have any speaking moments with anybody next to me doesn't really make much sense if I could do this at home. And now the stigma of me watching at home has been eliminated. Like, it's okay. Online church is now okay. So what are we going to do as the church to bring or highlight what is important about in-person practice if we're not creating these spaces for this dialogue? So what the flipped church could do, or what the flipped model does, is it brings the best of both worlds in terms of the best parts of in-person fellowship and the best parts of online learning. So in terms of accessibility, that's one big bonus of the online. I don't have to listen at a certain time. I don't have to be online at a certain time. If it's pre-recorded, I can listen to it at any time. And I know as long as I listen to the sermon before I get to class or before I get to the church, I will have the content that I need to be able to engage in these dialogues. Spaces for dialogue is going to be critical, because again, why am I coming if I'm not able to engage or able to have these conversations and dialogues in small groups? So how it would work, the preacher sends out the message in advance. Whenever we get to church, everyone has already watched the sermon, right? Everyone has the sermon. We all have the content information. When we get to church, we have praise and worship. We do that. The preacher still comes into the pulpit, 5-10 minute review. Remember, this is what the sermon was about. These are the questions I want you guys to wrestle with. And then we break out into small groups. And within these small groups, we have a minister, or we have a group leader. We have someone who's been trained by the church to start asking these questions and wrestling with, how did the sermon impact you? What is it that you can relate to in this? And now there's value for my attendance. There's value for me physically coming to church. One thing that a lot of my participants said was, if I go to church or not, church is still going to run without me. So me physically being there doesn't really matter. I can catch it online. And having this flip model where you're working in small groups and you get to share your perspective, if you're not there, there's an impact. And if you're not there, someone's not going to get to hear your testimony. If you're not there, you're not going to be able to hear how other people have done whatever it is that you're going through, or wrestle with whatever you're doing in this season. So it created space for dialogues. It helps you wrestle. And again, learning is a social activity. So if you want people to really retain and be able to learn this content and this information within the sermon moment or the preaching moment, you have to create spaces for people to dialogue. And then it adds value to attendance. And one thing that a lot of my participants said is they didn't feel valued within their church, especially those who went to large churches. And creating these small groups creates more one-to-one interaction, which helps with buy-in from the people who are coming into your service. So two things, and some of this work is based off of a book by Breonna Taylor called What Google Can't Give. And it's really going to be, how are churches going to differentiate themselves from the online space? So once we can come back in person, what's the point of coming? Why? Like, what are we going to be doing different in person that I can't get online? And there are two real big highlights that Breonna Taylor pointed out, and I build out, Breonna Parker pointed out, and I build off of here, and it's service and community. Those two things are very hard to replicate in online spaces, and churches that highlight these are going to be able to pull people back into their physical spaces if that's the goal, but it's going to cause a more robust interaction whenever we are able to attend again. So first, in terms of service, again, most of the service I can do from behind the computer screen might be giving, but churches that really highlight benevolence and impacting their physical world, impacting their physical community, being change agents within their community, and affecting change, those are ones that are going to have people flock back to and say, you know what, I really want to be a part of this body or a part of this congregation, because they're doing work within the community and physically impacting the world that I can't do from behind the computer screen. So whether that's social justice work or community benevolence or delivering meals, whatever it is that you're physically impacting your world, churches that are movements in that direction or protesting, those are going to be the spaces where people really flock to and say, I want to be a part of this church because they're doing things in person or organizing things or creating opportunities for me to serve that I wouldn't be able to do on my own or do behind a computer screen. And then second, again, in-person fellowship is still, from my research, in-person fellowship is still the highlight or the cornerstone practice of what people are looking for in terms of faith engagement. So online community can be supplemental, but really they're looking for authentic community and people to connect with. And that's going to take the form of very different things for different people. For some people, it's a Bible study group, and that's the in-person fellowship they need, and they're good. For some people, it's going to be praise and worship and finding a choir that they can serve in. But in some way, shape, or form, people are still seeking in-person fellowship. And churches or ministries that are able to create communities of learners or safe spaces or places for people to really feel like I can connect with someone who gets it, who identifies with me, who doesn't judge me, who I can wrestle with these ideas, and add some type of value to attendance where they can share or they can provide their own perspectives. Those are the churches that once COVID-19 is over, that people are going to flock back to. The ones that kind of revert back to church as usual, it's going to be hard to get some of the people who have become accustomed to online church to come back into service if you're not creating these opportunities for service or this authentic community. And I think that flipping church and providing these in-person spaces where people can talk and share and learn from each other is one of the ways that you can do that. And with that, I'm going to open it up to discussion. I think we're good on time. And just some questions to wrestle with as I look at the chat here. How has COVID-19 impacted your faith practices? Do you think the flipped church model is possible? If there's anything that I kind of went over that didn't make sense, and then how are you rethinking church in terms of these perspectives? Yes, it's good to hear that you use this in your classroom, this model. Yeah, the flipped classroom model has been popular for years, especially in the K through 12, and now higher education is catching on to it. Even watching, I still work at Penn State, and even watching how higher education has shifted more or totally to online environments, it's been very interesting. But once we are able to come back to in-person classrooms or even in-person church, what is going to be the value of in-person? Because sitting and listening to a lecture, once we get used to doing this over a computer screen, why am I physically attending? Yes, sermon reviews. Yeah, I know there are still a lot of churches that do sermon reviews from the previous week, but like you said, allowing the congregation to see the sermon and then come prepared to discuss. And one of the downsides of the flipped church, to be transparent, is people have to do their homework. So people have to do the work at home, watching the lecture at home beforehand. Or else if they don't watch the sermon and they come to church unprepared, they can still talk. I'm sure that they still have testimony and things that they can catch up with. But it's a lot more of a dynamic discussion when you can have these conversations together when everyone's on the same page. So good question. How do you get older congregations to embrace this model? So that was my fear when I was first thinking about this, because I didn't think that, pastors would even record themselves and send it out. But now that they are, I think that the first half of it is happening. But I also think that churches can still do a hybrid model. So you can do your Sunday service as normal, right? You can, for everyone who wants to still come on Sunday and listen to the preached word in person, do your Sunday service as normal, but record it, right? Post it on Sunday. And then for your group of people who are watching online on Sunday, have them come in throughout the week. You can create either online small groups, or you can create Wednesday night small groups, Thursday night small groups, and have them elect when they want to come in to do the sermon discussion. And then it takes that stigma of, oh my gosh, you watch church online, but you don't have any in-person fellowship. It allows people to still watch church online on Sunday if they want, or whenever they want throughout the week. And then that group of people who would rather engage in person can come to a different worship service later in the week. So you can have both going on simultaneously. But it's really about, for the people who are comfortable with the online spaces, creating in-person spaces for them to still have fellowship. Because the stigma is almost, if I watch online, I don't want to come into church, and that's not true. And that's not what my research pointed to. Even if I'm connecting online, I still want to engage. I just want to be in a space when I do come in person where my engagement is valued and my perspective is valued, and you've created a space for me to feel like I can talk and discuss. Yes, people absolutely need in-person fellowship, and they're seeking it. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's just, are we creating spaces for them to do so if they're not there on a Sunday? Can we create spaces for them to do it alternatively? Continuing virtual and then coming together to dialogue and have fellowship. We can run the video before for those who missed it, then dialogue. Yeah, you could do that too. If they want to watch the video together, they could come an hour earlier. And for people who already watched the video at some other point in time, and again, this is about accessibility. So some people don't want to be synchronous, or some people don't want to watch the word at the same time as everybody else, either because they can't, they have other things going on, or just their lifestyle is such that they can't physically be wherever they need to be on a Sunday. So they want to watch it at home. But for those people who want to watch the preached word at home, how can we create spaces in person within my church community so that they can still have that authentic in-person fellowship? Okay, so to Carol's point, my church is 6,000 people plus. I'm not sure if it'll work for a congregation that large, particularly with no real room for small groups. Good point. So I think that the small groups might not happen on the same day. And this is really about flexibility. So it wouldn't be only on Sundays we're having small groups. You could have a group on Sundays who do the small groups, but you could also have a Monday night group. You can have an online group, because some people still might just want to connect online or physically are not in your local area. To Dr. Wesley's point earlier, there the amount of people that you may have streaming into your church right now during COVID might not be from your local community. So after COVID, can you continue to create spaces, or even now, can you create online spaces for them to have that fellowship with other people? So in terms of room for small groups, I think you would have to distribute the groups over multiple days of the week so that they can choose and select when is best for them, and or create hybrid groups so that they can still zoom in or connect online with groups, even if they're not physically coming in person. Um, to Bonnie's point, my research, I just got confirmation that my dissertation got approved by the grad school yesterday. So as soon as I get my signatures, it will be published either later this month or early August. So I'll have it published soon. And I have a website. You can connect with me either by email if you have any additional questions, or I didn't answer anything, or you're interested in talking more. I have a website that has some of this and some other resources in terms of what online platforms you can use to connect with people and to create these small groups. If you're looking for an online community and an online faith community, Daughter of a King organization has an Instagram page and a website. But they're an awesome group that is building out this online community, especially for millennial Black women, or just millennial women of color. And if you're interested in seeing some of the things that they do in terms of their online community building, they're doing a great job as well. But that is my information if anyone has any questions that I was not able to answer. And you guys can keep typing it in. Thank you, thank you, thank you for all the congratulations. Congregants of 60 and up, and has this worked? Haven't tried it, so I can't say if it's worked or not. But what I did say was that if your 60 and up population is comfortable with the online sermons and they would prefer, and I was also thinking that this model can be used as we like start to gradually come back in person, right? So right now, or as the CDC continues to evolve and tell us what we can and can't do, whenever we're ready to do like 50, 50 people or 25 people or whatever, and you might have congregants who are 60 plus who don't want to come back in a large space yet, but they want to do small groups. You can create these spaces of small groups where you can still send out the message and say, this was the sermon that we talked about, and then have them come in small groups for the fellowship and do the praise and worship then. So I'm not sure if they're comfortable with the online space. You can create these small groups for them to come in person. If they're not comfortable with the online space and they miss the traditional church, you can still do this model and still have your traditional Sunday service as you have it now, and have people who want to elect into, I want to watch the preached word on Sunday. We're still going to have it. But for those of you who prefer to connect online, we appreciate you too. There's no stigma against you watching online, but we'll see you later in the week and we'll have these fellowship opportunities. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you guys. I appreciate the congratulations. Yeah, yeah. To your point, I think a lot will be afraid to come back at first. So these small groups might be a way to slowly usher people back in. I would absolutely recommend a survey about feelings in terms of worship and fellowship, 100%, because you don't know, and people have a lot of opinions and perceptions, and no one's really asking the congregation how they feel about things. So definitely, and on my website, I kind of outline Google Forms, but even sending something like a Google form out to everybody, and it lets them select in terms of what are your perceptions. You can have different radio buttons or a drop down menu or things like that, and asking what's your likelihood of coming back to a full service. If we had small groups, would you be more inclined to come back to a group like that? If we continue to do worship, or if we continue to do the preaching moment online, would you be willing to come in person for in-person fellowship, or would you be willing to come in for in-person worship, or would you be more willing to continue watching online and then doing the small groups for fellowship? But I think conducting a survey is a really good idea, and then you'll be able to tell your numbers in terms of, if people do come back, this is what we're expecting, and how many small groups you're going to need to create. If you want 8 to 12 people in these groups, is it going to be multiple days a week, multiple sessions, things like that, and then you can rotate who's coming in, and that could help keep your numbers down as well. Absolutely, absolutely. Again, my contact information is there if you have any other questions, or want any of my scholarship, or once my paper's published, you can send me a note and I can send that your way as well. And my website is there. It has a couple additional resources. And thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Again, to the organizers of the conference, thank you all for allowing me the space to talk about my research. And if you know anyone who could benefit from this, please send them my way. Absolutely.